So this is On Psi, Psychic Science and Beyond. And Hussein already knows that my PowerPoint died. So doesn't need that introduction. So this is a quickly reproduced version of the talk that I was going to do, but I think it focused it down a little bit. One of the things I think that sort of I think a lot about is, when we think about psychic functioning, when we think about psychic abilities and, sort of the history of psychism, there's a major difference in what we have today and sort of where it started from. So in 1882 was when the Society for Psychical Research, was founded with, some pretty heavy academic, um, you know, folks that were focused on this. You had, William James, father of modern psychology, Henri Bergson, who's a, continental philosopher of note, evolutionary thinker. You had William Crookes, a major, chemist and scientist, physicist. And what they were mainly looking at was seance phenomenon, ghosts, a little bit of psychokinesis, but their focus was really on, survival, life after death, and sort of a philosophical take, trying to bring those questions into the realm of science. But they had a lot of, people in the humanities as well that were interacting with them. And the kind of things that they were looking at really almost become fodder for what we now have as paranormal TV, ghost hunting, sort of, there were questions of demonology a little bit. It's sort of sprinkled in through Andrew Lang. You know, there was some connectivity with the Golden Dawn at the time. Henri Bergson's sister, Moina Mathers, eventually would become head of the Golden Dawn. So there was, some crystal gazing and that kind of thing. But it was, it was very Victorian and, sort of not exactly what we would think of in terms of, something like the Remote Viewing Project and psychic espionage and that. And so I think that, it's really interesting to sort of look at the progress that we go through, because this term psychic, carries throughout this thing, but it's not necessarily the same tenor today as it was when that started. By the time we get to the 30s, we've got Rhine, JB Rhine at Duke University, doing, laboratory testing, and where we get kind of the development, the hardening of laboratory parapsychology. And tests like the Zener card tests, which were, the card guessing, card, sensing and intuition for what symbol was on the card, made famous in the Ghostbusters movie. And it very almost boring, repetitive tests for people's psychic functioning, whether it was telekinesis, as you see with the dice in the top picture, or telepathy, clairvoyance, as you see with the ESP cards there. Ryan also sort of, throughout this period was a really interesting kind of engagement with these studies, with the popular culture. Obviously, the Society for Psychical Research, went head to head constantly with folks like Houdini, and some even members of their own, more, I guess, apologetic magicians and that, it became sort of they were really part of the science that they were looking at when they went into the seance room, or when they went through these things, was to sort of debunk and to find ways to see if there was trickery, and there was quite often, and so it became that conversation really was what led to, the kind of popular conversation. Houdini, H.P. Lovecraft famously ghost wrote a Houdini story, where Houdini became sort of a almost like a proto superhero, you know, going out and sort of doing battle in the, you know, the sort of Orientalist psychic milieu. That became a popular comic trope. A lot of, unfortunately, racist underpinnings to some of that, you know, and it became, it had this engagement with the popular culture that you know, sort of framed it in this kind of contentious way. Um, One of the interesting things about Ryan is that he sort of brought it into the public because of what he was testing, whereas the Society for Psychical Research was looking at, you know, mediums and spiritualist phenomena, seances, that kind of stuff. Um, the thing that Ryan did beyond just sort of hardening laboratory parapsychology, he also sort of brought this idea out that everyone had these abilities for precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, you know, and so he, in doing his tests, was not interested in mediums or, you know, high functioning psychics necessarily, although he did, you know, kind of zero in on certain people. But he was looking at this as something that was kind of a common trait amongst everyone, and he was testing his students. You know, he and he famously popularized the Zener cards through a radio program that he did, where he actually allowed the public to engage with these tests. You know, it was kind of a call-in show. The cards were available at sort of the Walmart of the day. You know, you could go and get them. They sold out. It was very popular. And it really brought it to the public. It became problematic in the sense that, you know, the cards that they had actually issued weren't the best quality. So when skeptics started to look at it, they were saying, well, these cards are transparent, you know, the math is wrong. And it really, it's so that it also sort of, you know, this contention between the skeptics and the parapsychologists develops. Once we get to the 50s, there's an interesting sort of blend of the laboratory parapsychology and the sort of SPR focus on mediumship, and that through folks like Andrija Puharich, who you know, was building Faraday cages, sort of testing this electromagnetic theory of transmission for mediumship and precognition and telepathy. He famously worked with Eileen Garrett, who founded the Parapsychology Foundation, and also was a really interesting figure in that she was a liaison to the more of the upper class of society. She was a medium for Salvador Dali. She was friends with Aldous Huxley. She actually published Doors of Perception in her magazine, Tomorrow Magazine. You know, and Tomorrow Magazine was, you know, quarterly review of psychical research is what it started out as. And it was kind of a, you know, a variety magazine of psychic research, anthropology, sociology, you know, sort of new thought and social conscious thought. Interesting in the fact that, unlike a lot of her contemporaries, she had an interest in the Caribbean and Africa. And so, you know, there was a lot of writing and sort of cross correspondence with anthropologists who were looking at magic traditions and psychic traditions in the Caribbean and in Africa, which the Society for Psychical Research didn't really do. J.B. Ryan's work didn't really touch on that. So a really interesting figure, and also was really helpful in linking up people with funding to researchers. And herself being, you know, a world famous medium, put herself in the experiments quite often, as with Puharich. Now, once we get to the 60s and the 70s, we start to get this different flavor. And this is kind of where what we have today comes from. It's not so much the psychical research stuff. It's not even really the Rhine stuff. What happens in the 60s and the 70s is the space program kicks in. And the space program starts to become the focus for funding and interest in telekinesis and parapsychology and these things. One, there was a little bit of testing to see if telepathy could be a good way to um, project thoughts to the to the spaceship, right? So when they launch up into space, how are we going to get communication up there? Well, what if we tried telepathy? And obviously this was not a main focus, but there was some thought to this, and this was, a question that was had because, in the 50s and that with, as you can see with Eileen Garrett's Tomorrow Magazine, this wasn't ghost hunting shows and goofiness. She was dealing with some fairly serious establishment people in writing, and cultural theorists like Aldous Huxley and that, who had money, had connections, had social clout. And so, when we come into the early space race kind of thing, there's this seriousness there that ESP, has been, tangentially proven through the work of Ryan and the Zener card radio programs and this kind of thing is floating through. If you go to the archive material on magazines that are published at the time that are focused on this stuff, it's much more prevalent to have magazines specifically focused on psychic culture. The International Association for the Preservation of Occult and Spiritualist Periodicals has a massive archive that you can access online, which shows just how prevalent and how sort of ingrained the psychic culture was, which has been erased, in the same way that we can look at the Society for Psychical Research and think, oh, it's the same as Rhine, or it's the same as what was happening at SRI. But if you actually look at these different cultural objects, they're very, very different. And this photo here kind of encapsulates when the dam broke on contemporary sort of psychic research and, especially applied psychic research. And this is the Earthrise photo, which became famous, as one of the first photos of Earth from the moon, right? So this represents that moment when the space program succeeded in getting astronauts to the moon. We have this photo of Earth, and this photo encapsulates not just this, technological victory for the United States and for the space race, it also encapsulates that moment where Edgar Mitchell has his, sort of break, where he sees this harmonious universe that's so different than his kind of day-to-day and the earthly thing that we all encounter in society. He has this break that, just completely shifts his consciousness, and, reported by many other astronauts, but Edgar Mitchell comes back with the fact that during his space flight, he'd been doing ESP research, using some of the Rhine figures, not using the cards, because, it would, every little piece of anything that you take up into space weighs something, becomes problematic. So he ditched the cards, kept the symbols, and was doing ESP experiments in space. And he comes back with this idea of this harmonious whole, this universal whole, this cosmic consciousness, which had been talked about in the 1800s surrounding the Psychical, Society for Psychical Research. However, the Society for Psychical Research focus was very much on this sort of scientifically investigating life after death, mediumship, and that sort of thing. So this cultural product that was the cosmic consciousness, which became New Thought, the books publishing in tandem, oftentimes citing Society for Psychical Research, their periodicals and that, the New Thought authors were always sort of off to the side, or they weren't. There was never this admittance that these two things were really together. But with this sort of holism that Mitchell brings back, we have this birth of contemporary psychical studies, which brings it out of these kind of siloed areas even culturally siloed in you know what Eileen Garrett was doing with anthropology and mediumship and that, and it brings this cosmic consciousness to the forefront. And you know, that's also apparent in things that were sort of tangential to what you know, the Institute of Noetic Science is founded in the early 70s. You also have the SRI remote viewing projects kicking in. And in an interesting sort of moment of crossover, you have Harold Sherman, who is he's famous for doing some clairvoyant tests in the 1930s, searching for downed Russian planes in the Arctic Circle, which had also been published over the radio. He wrote a famous book on his experiences. He worked with a famous explorer that was flying around up in the Arctic Circle looking for this downed Russian plane. Harold Sherman gets pulled in by Puthoff to work with Ingo Swann to view Jupiter before the Pioneer 10 gets there. So again, this tie between the space race, this expanded, you know, sense of what it means to be human, where we're going, and all of that. But then also here linking it to, you know, how to make ESP work for you. That was Harold Sherman's book in the 60s, right? Before he's doing these experiments with Ingo Swann, he's writing, you know, ESP, you know, popular books on giving people ESP abilities and putting out LPs, you know, advanced techniques in ESP. So he's popularizing, you know, psychic functioning. He's also, you know, again, like I said, in the 30s, he had been doing radio programs talking about his, you know, psychic experiments that he had done in the Arctic Circle. He's popularizing this throughout the 60s, and then he's now joining what would become known now as the government psychic program through Puthoff and SRI to view Jupiter with Ingo Swann. You know, but you can see the difference between how to make ESP work for you, you know, and the sort of cosmic sense that's being brought into it, right? And that's this transition. What really highlights that transition is, you know, Ingo Swann it was always a sort of difficult figure in the SRI work. Ingo Swann helped found remote viewing, which was the government psychic spy programs, protocols, methodology. He helped formulate those. He was one of the first people to sort of work in depth on that, one of the first people to be pulled in to be the active psychic in that. Previously, he'd been doing work with the American Society for Psychical Research on out-of-body studies. He'd already become sort of a noted psychic in that sense when he was brought into the SRI program. In the late 70s, he decides to write a novel about his experiences in the psychic warfare program. And remember, this program isn't declassified until 95. So here in the late 70s, Ingo Swann's writing a novelization of his experience as a psychic spy, and calls Stephen Halpern, who is one of the pioneers of New Age music, developing sort of ambient meditative music, who himself had a download experience in either the late 60s or early 70s, which gave him this sense of sort of beatless music without a beat to it, that would allow people to expand their consciousness. You think of sort of the Robert Monroe Hemisync kind of developments that went into that. Robert Monroe, of course, also working alongside SRI to train remote viewers and to help that process along. So Stephen Halpern had created this cosmic sound. He then later interacts with a channeler who gives him access to the entities that she's working with, who train him in this furthering of his sense of this music that he's producing, this new sound, which he was only able to produce through synthesizers. Was it a Roland, Dave? A Roland? synthesizer.
Sure.
You know, and so he takes this new sound and he's creating it. Ingo Swann's heard this music on the West Coast and contacts Halpern and says, "Hey, I want a soundtrack for the movie that's going to come out of my book." And they make this soundtrack, Star Children, Turn On Your Drive. And the lyrics to it were Ingo Swann's lyrics, which he wrote basically to awaken the psychic potentials of humanity. Now, this isn't this isn't how to make ESP work for you, though. This is Star Children, right? So these are cosmically, cosmic consciously infused psychics who are carrying on Edgar Mitchell's, experience that he had when he was in space of this harmonious whole, but also connected to this, you know, weaponized in the sense that, psychism, where it's an incredibly focused methodology for how to develop your psychic abilities, plus this music, which Stephen Halpern feels was downloaded as the new music for this new breed, this new age, this new, sort of culture, which is cosmic, which is run by the Star Children. And that, interesting to the Star Children concept as well, is that John White, who co-founded, he was the first, I believe, president for the Institute of Noetic Science with Edgar Mitchell, or he was the first educational programming director. He was basically second in charge at the Institute of Noetic Science when it was founded. John White had come up with this term Homo noeticus, which was the next step in human evolution. Now, if you go back to the early Society for Psychical Research material, Henri Bergson is talking about psychic abilities in terms of sort of an evolutionary move in humanity. But he's really theorizing pretty deeply about this in terms of the sort of, a caterpillar emerging into a butterfly. Definitely has this evolutionary drift, but what he doesn't have is the cosmic consciousness aspect of, we actually went to space and people have had this overview effect, where they've been awakened to this actual physical sense of being in space. The Star Children become real. You have the sense of this cosmic consciousness, which had been sort of in a protean form in the 1800s, becomes a reality for these people, like Edgar Mitchell, who actually experienced it up in space, or Ingo Swann, who was involved in remote viewing planets and with satellites actually going out there physically, then confirming and not confirming. So the sense of consciousness is expanded through technology, through technologizing the psychic functioning in terms of the remote viewing methodology, and then also the technology of the synthesizers, which allows Stephen Halpern to make his new music, and so we have this very different sense. And this sense then is sort of, here's his book that was only available for a short period of time when it came out, because obviously when you create a novel based on a highly classified program that is involved with, the novel actually is about the United States versus Russia, both of whom have not just weaponized psychic programs, but also weaponized psychotronic programs and microwave weapons. It's actually pretty stunning to read this book now and see just how far Ingo went where he shouldn't have gone in 1978, 1979 with this book. And it becomes obvious why this book never really got pushed out and the movie was never made. Stephen Halpern has just re-released in a remastered form Star Children, and I highly recommend everybody listen to it. It's a fun awakening of your drives. But what's interesting is that, SRI as a think tank wasn't just government aligned, it was also corporate aligned. And so part of the program that they were developing, obviously it's funding for the remote viewing, and that came a lot from the Department of Defense and intelligence agencies. But a lot of it drifted out into the corporate world through this idea of executive ESP. Michael, I know that you're familiar with this, the Douglas Dean experiments in the executive ESP, which had actually started prior to the SRI work in New Jersey, and had sort of been developing this idea of, and this coming out of the sort of Harold Sherman era of ESP where it was being popularized. How do we take this into the, businesses, right? In the 50s, in 1954, you had people like Peter Drucker, who was reimagining managerial science. And you had this kind of solidification of, corporate philosophy and how to run a business and what the right way to manage was and that kind of thing. And so executive ESP, at least the Douglas Dean research, sort of blended into that development of how do we take, these human potentials and use that to create better businesses. You'll notice here that two of the contributing authors are also the authors of Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. So at the time that this was published, there was also a sense of what psychic functioning and what psychic training could do to help the United States maintain, some superiority in the Cold War through its, sort of corporate mechanisms, which is a really interesting way to think about business and psychism, which are two things that probably you wouldn't necessarily put together in the first place. But then, here we have corporate, psychic, and, Cold War concerns. Later in the 80s, you would have executive ESP access your intuition for business success. So the 1974 executive ESP book is a little bit more scientific. It's written in the style of, that was kind of popular through the 30s and 50s of, kind of anecdotes from successful business people and but then tying that to the research to show what could be done with it. Executive ESP, Access Your Intuition for Business Success, is sort of a one-on-one training manual to, allow people to, in an executive function, to access their intuition, sort of soft selling the ESP thing, although Gerald Jackson has a much more new age focus than anything that was in the 1974 executive ESP book. It's very much, Gerald Jackson's book is very much the executive ESP for the new age. Once you get to the 90s, we have a complete soft selling of the ESP with The Intuitive Manager by Roy Rowan, who was a Fortune magazine writer. He cites both the Douglas Dean Executive ESP book and Gerald Jackson's Executive ESP book, but the psychic component of it is sort of shoved under. Something similar that you can see today in some of the news that came out a few years ago about some of the military programs that are still utilizing psychic functioning, which called it intuition and, sense making, and really reframed language around it, despite the fact that what they were essentially talking about was what in the past would have been called ESP. Today, this is seeing an interesting sort of reformatting and again, another moment where we're in right now, which is kind of the hot trends aspect of it. We're moving into the hot trends now, where in the same way that Harold Sherman sort of bridges into the, bridges this 1950s and 1960s ESP research into the SRI work, what we're seeing now is all of this stuff being, sort of smashed together again and reformatted for the 21st century. Julia Mossbridge, who is a fellow at the Institute of Noetic Science, heavily involved in multiple projects, including the Sophia artificial intelligence robot that, has made the rounds in a lot of different sort of global settings. it's sort of a humanoid, the machine learning platform that you can talk to. She's been doing some work with that to try to see if there was a way to interact with Sophia and program a sense of love into artificial intelligence and machine learning. She's been building a lot of different kind of psychic facing apps. She'll be speaking at South by Southwest coming up on a time travel app that she's working on to sort of enhance a person's sense of their extended self. But here, her work with Carmen Medina, who is a former, I believe, CIA officer, her work on intuition and business intelligence, and tying basically the remote viewing protocols to business analytics. And her work was recently published in the Emergent Risk International's 2022 Strategic Intelligence Estimate. So this is a think tank that works with corporations and non-government organizations, and probably some government organizations, to discuss emerging risks over the next year, 5 years. And one of the articles that they include in their 2022 publication is Julia and Carmen's write-up on basically a reformatting of the remote viewing protocols and some of the executive ESP intuition protocols that have been developed into a business analytics tool, which again is not something that we've seen for about 2 decades now. This kind of bridging of the corporate intelligence, military, and parapsychological research. You know, and this goes directly back to, you know, the sort of work that SRI was doing, and really is not, they're still a think tank that has those allegiances, but they're not doing this kind of work. So this work is being done, you know, a little bit more ad hoc. A sort of interesting development over my day today was, as my PowerPoint did not transfer from my office, it was interesting to look back on my day and see that all throughout the day, I had these interactions with different researchers that sort of highlighted aspects of psychic potentials now in a contemporary sense, but also in the fact that online we all have these conversations with each other, you know, and sort of it sort of grows, and we are basically, you know, we're doing continuous research and continuous conversations, continuous development of these ideas. And the researcher Leonard George had actually mentioned something very interesting. He's a former chair of psychology at Capilano University. He's done a lot of work in Mongolia with Mongolian shamans, and written a lot about altered states. He had worked with the Rhine Research Institute in the early 80s. And he was talking about a paper that he had done, which was an analysis of the sheep-goat problem. And it was a really interesting take on it, because he said that when he analyzed all of the papers published on the sheep-goat problem and their effect ratios, what he found was that neither the sheep nor the goats did very well at the end of the day. That it was actually a middle ground between the sheep who believe and the goats who don't that had the best psychic functioning in terms of his analysis of the paper. So it was a distance from it. It was a sort of neither sense that actually led to the best psychic functioning, which I thought was really interesting in terms of the sort of reported, you know, psychic events that happen casually online, or even things like what happened to Eric and I today. In my previous presentation, which is now lost in the office, I was looking for a quote from Julia Moss-Bridges' book, The Premonition Code. And I had come across uh, her discussion of precognitive dreams. And as we will discuss shortly in regard to Eric Wargo's work, precognitive dreaming is actually one of the easiest ways to get precognitive information, which again is sort of interesting to Leonard George's point of this neither sheep nor goats. Well, in your dream life, you don't really have a choice. You're sort of just there and it's happening. Um, but what was interesting was that when I was looking at their chapter on the precognitive dreaming, I realized that they actually were wrong in the history of precognitive dreaming. So they say that precognitive dreams are by far the most reported psychic experiences by Westerners, but this wasn't always the case. And Eric and I had been looking at sort of the history of precognitive dreaming and writing back and forth on it. And what I had found was that precognitive dream literature, visionary dream literature, was actually one of the most popular forms of the like literary expression in the ancient and medieval world. The number of poems, short treaties and stuff on dreaming was crazy, and it was all based on these visionary sort of prophetic sense. Now, if you're a scientist looking at that, you may not recognize what it is, but this came out of some stuff I was doing with looking at dream traditions and lucid dream traditions related to the three wise men. And there was just so much there that was coded into the culture that had only been looked at by English professors and professors of literature, but it hadn't been really addressed by people looking at parapsychology, or any of these kind of comparative things. So when I read that, I was like, oh man, that's not true. They said that it wasn't taken seriously until Freud and Jung, and sure, in the sense of that we look at Freud and Jung as sort of these markers of when a certain way of looking at dreaming happened, but culturally that it just wasn't true. So I sent that to Eric, and it turned out that Eric at that very moment had gotten an email from Julia Moss-Bridges, co-author of the Premonition Code. And again, this goes back to what Leonard George had pointed out today, of this kind of, not believing, not believing. I wasn't even thinking about anything other than this is wrong. I sent it to Eric. It connected in this strange sort of time loopy precognitive sense. And then, and I was looking specifically at this because it works in with some of the stuff that Diana Pasulka had pointed out in American Cosmic, about ways that, her contact Tyler and her contact James had accessed psychic abilities, and also Eric's with precognition. So it just, it fit in with the talk, but it was interesting that in expressing that, it suddenly became an example of a sort of psychic thing in and of itself. Now, one of the interesting things about this sort of revamp of the the Stanford Research Institute's work is that we're at a point in time when we have an opportunity to go back and actually look at the records. The Rice archives now have Ed May's papers, and we can actually look at it and see what's going on. And that's something that Eric Wargo has done. One of the most famous examples of remote viewing is done by Pat Price on the far right here. It is of a military installation in Russia, which up to this point has sort of been gone down in history as the most exciting example of remote viewing. Now, the description that Pat Price did, Eric found by going back in the archives, matches Cold War propaganda, and in a magazine article that was published after Pat Price's death, which was sort of the exciting part. But it doesn't match the actual site, and it doesn't match what the Russians were actually doing. It matches the mediated propaganda, which, as Eric details in an article for the SSE, the Society for Scientific Exploration. Pat Price was most likely either just sort of at its worst, he was just recreating rumors that he had heard about this site from people that were filling his head with disinfo and propaganda to get funding for weapon systems. And at best, he was foreseeing some of the information that would end up in these articles. And it's not necessarily the best example of remote viewing. It would be a really interesting example, though, of what Eric describes as the long self, and precognition within his own timeline, if it wasn't just him sort of rehashing what would sound good to get funding. And that's this reconception of time, which, isn't necessarily as sexy sounding, I think, for a lot of people as clairvoyance and the rest of it. But if we're actually going to utilize these things, is much more useful to know how it actually works. And that's what Eric details in his works, Time Loops, and Precognitive Dream Work, and the Long Self. Some of the other work that's going on right now that's really interesting, which sort of goes outside of the long self concept, is the work with random number generators that Mark Bacuzzi at Windbridge is doing, which I really enjoy because I've got a soft spot for radionics, and I have a soft spot for some of the borderland science research stuff, and the psionics and that. And Mark is creating these machines that have fun with psychic potentials. And so one of his experiments, which he is adamant about not being a strictly scientific experiment, this is more, playing around and seeing what it can do. He's not making any claims on this. The psi forms, which is what you see before you here, what they do is it feeds meditative intention into a random number generator. So you have a meditator who's wherever in the world meditating on an intention, and that intention then, based on decades of experiments with random number generators, there seems to be a possibility that there's some effect going on there with intention and these random number generators. And so it feeds into that, which then the data set from that intention hitting the random number generator is fed into a graphic program that Mark designed, and it creates these psi forms. One of the interesting kind of extensions of this is that Mark has done other experiments to see if the data set itself will then affect people's behavior outside of that. And he has some experimental results that show that that may be a possibility, which is where this gets into the radionics and the kind of borderland science research work. And so with that, you have this sense that the meditator meditates, it hits the random number generator, or the random number generator is synchronizing, however, whatever goes on between those things. This image is created, the data set sits in between that whole process, and the intention that's fed into the data set then can also reflect from these psi forms. So the psi forms themselves become sort of a mandala kind of meditation device that can then project that intention out. So these are the prompts that were given, that the meditator said that they were meditating on when these images were created. And so the hope, in the sense of Julia's work with the AI and finding ways to make machine learning kind of have a sense of love, or whatever that would mean, a more loving output. Mark is kind of working in that domain as well in terms of creating, media that can then project that out and sort of reformat things. Diana Pasulka is another interesting contemporary researcher who has, subtly in her book given some of these tools, through the character of Tyler and James, who are kind of central to a certain portion of the book, being the meta experiencers, the high level scientists, and corporate, for in Tyler's instance, people who utilize, human potentials and psychic functioning in order to better what they do. Tyler had a specific protocol that she mentions, which I found very interesting because in reading Tyler's protocol, I thought, one, it sounded really similar to a lot of the stuff that was written in the what I'm calling the Harold Sherman era, sort of psychic training books. If you read those, what Tyler's protocol outlines, incredibly similar. If you go back farther than that to the 20s and you read some of the material from the, the spiritualists and that, and the New Thought era, really similar kind of thing. What struck me was that I didn't think, based on Tyler's background, that he would have been reading that stuff. And interestingly enough, I went and in that Gerald Jackson Executive ESP book, I thought, surely Tyler's protocol is going to be in this book, and opened up a page and there it was. Like, it was a nice moment again of sort of just having a spontaneous, this was the right time, right place, open the book and there it is. But this protocol that Tyler outlines basically fits within this thing. And in Tyler's case, I really don't think that he read that stuff. It's simply what he was doing and how he was getting these experiences that he's had. He is operating under the theory that DNA is a receptor and a transmitter working at a certain frequency. This again is what really similar to what Mark's doing with those psi forms. The idea that a certain frequency of intention can go out into the random number generator, affect it, create a data set. The data set then creates an image. This is what Stephen Halpern was doing with his music. He feels that he can put the intention in, play it. You're then going to receive that intention through the means of hearing the music that he plays. There's some scientific backing that's not parapsychology and not psychical and not fringe, that does show that there is some ability to transfer intentionality through art, voice, and music and that kind of thing. Even reading, there was a recent article that came out about the ability to transfer sort of mind states and emotive states through writing and that. So Tyler, operating under this idea that DNA is a receptor and transmitter working at a certain frequency, he ties it to the satellites. So again, Tyler works with NASA, so that makes sense that he would think that. But Star Children, Ingo Swann, Stephen Halpern, the cosmic consciousness, we have this cosmic thing keeps coming back, and it keeps getting deeper and deeper in the fact that Tyler is not Ingo Swann, right? Like, he's not a New York artist painting giant visionary galactic paintings and going and viewing Jupiter through astral travel. Tyler is a meta experiencer that works with NASA and the corporate world and is making patents and that kind of thing. But he's talking like Ingo Swann would talk, without the sense, really the sort of missionary sense maybe that Ingo had, or the power that Ingo had in terms of his owning his psychic potentials. But Tyler is doing something with it, and it's almost as if the kind of things that were driving Ingo in this massive way are underlying everything that Tyler does. despite the fact that he's, you know, straight-laced businessman working for NASA and researcher. You know, he has this idea that you have to tune the body and the DNA to these frequencies. Again, going back to what Mark's doing with those psi forms, that's kind of what they're designed to do, is tune the body. Halpern's music is tuning the body, that kind of thing. And he has this protocol that, you know, he makes sure he gets enough sleep. He tries to get 8 hours plus. He does a sort of bifurcated sleep pattern, which is good for inducing lucid dreaming, good for inducing hypnagogia. He doesn't drink alcohol. Alcohol disrupts sleep patterns, so he avoids that, and doesn't drink coffee. Again, coffee kind of jacks up your system, so he avoids that. Messes up the signal. So he's really using his body and for, you know, forming it. This is the same kind of stuff that you would do in yoga. You know, I mean, he's physically, or Tai Chi probably would be a better example. You know, he's turning his body into a tool to get these transmissions and to get this transfer. Down to the level of interacting with the sun, right? So he vitamin D and sunlight and that kind of thing. But he's now this sense of cosmic consciousness where he's comparing these mental transmissions and these creative transmissions to this DNA transference, where his DNA is vibrating at a frequency similar to the frequencies of deep space satellites. He's interacting with celestial bodies, the sun and that kind of thing, sleep patterns and all of that. He's attuning his body to become this, you know, to work within that sort of holism that Edgar Mitchell had envisioned. But and again, this is a businessman with patents that works for NASA, and he's doing this stuff without being like the weirdo, you know, psychic guy out there. Like, this is just how he operates. So it's becoming normalized in a you know, he's one of the star children, right? And you know, he then feels a connection, establishes connection when the thoughts that show up in his mind don't seem like my own. This is something that Ingo Swann said when he was talking about the hardest thing about psychic functioning is knowing where the psychic signal is, because the psychic signal is not your intuition, it's not your imagination, it's not your cognition, it's a third that sits somewhere in there that is different. And so what Tyler's talking about here is reaching into that. And what was really interesting, another sort of thing that fed into my psychic journey through today, my psychic you know, adventure, was earlier Hussein Ali Agrama had a talk with Jeff Kripal on a webinar for the Archives of the Impossible opening. And he mentioned this thing about Ingo Swann and perception from penetration and this other sense, this other way of seeing. And the amazing thing was I highlighted that in Ingo Swann's book, Natural ESP, last night as something that I wanted to talk about. So when I was listening to the webinar, I was like, oh man, Hussein just, you know, cited this exact part of what Ingo was doing that I wanted to highlight. Which then, you know, in finding this piece from Tyler in Diana's book, again, he's saying the same thing. And I hadn't made that connection with Tyler because I hadn't familiarized myself with this again. You know, this was tonight that, so I was trying to rebuild my dead PowerPoint that I found this. So it all, you know, kind of lined up. You know, and then there's James, who expresses his extraordinary creativity, again, patents and creating, you know, innovative ideas for industry. And he has this process where basically he puts the problem before himself. He then goes to bed and he has what he calls jokingly elves or assistants that come in, and, you know, he lets it, basically the problem, sit in his head and stew. And then when he wakes up, the answer, you know, is there, or in a couple days, he says. Now, this exact process, again, is in the New Thought material. you can literally pull this, verbatim, not necessarily in James's language, but this exact process is in the New Thought books. This exact process is in the Executive ESP books. This exact process is found all throughout this stuff. Starting in the late 1800s. Um, William Walker Atkinson in the New Thought stuff. He's talking about this in the early 20th century. Tying it to occult mind science. Um, did James read it there? It doesn't seem like it in the way that he's sourcing it. And it doesn't seem like he had read that stuff. He may have now, as he's gotten deeper into, investigating the UFO topic, and that some of the things that he's cited have been a little bit esoteric. But at the time he was developing this process for himself, I don't think that was the case. So again, there's this sort of underlying reality to these things, which these different people are finding in different ways, but socially and culturally is developing and evolving in this cosmic sense, in the sense of space, in the sense of kind of a unified humanity. Um, you know, this is more about James's process here. And that kind of ties it into, I think, interestingly enough, with the folks who are here at the talk, with Jeff Kripal's idea of the authors of the impossible. And this book, if you read the Amazon description, is described as sort of a survey of the development of paranormal thought throughout the 20th century, but or late 1800s through the 20th century. But I think really, if you look at it with the people that he's highlighted, they are themselves, and Jeff has talked a lot about authorizing people to have these beliefs, and the sort of the conversation around the New York Times piece on UFOs was that the New York Times has authorized us to talk about UFOs. So this sense of authorizing, and this focus in this, the quote that I pulled here, why continue to tolerate a kind of armchair skepticism, that has really nothing to do with the actual experiences that we have, the what science would if we actually look at these things rigorously scientifically, it still doesn't pan out to what the skeptics portray. It's rhetorical, it's propaganda, and why aren't we authorizing ourselves, to have this sort of relationship with our own, inner psychic functioning? And I think that is kind of where we're at this point in culture, with, all the material that we have on hand, to sort of, go back and look at these things, especially in creating this presentation and sort of looking at these ideas and looking at the sort of, small little windows that I did. There's a clear progression of how psychic functioning has been looked at over the years. And we're at a really interesting point now, again, that I think is sort of highlighted by Julia Mossbridge's feature in that emerging risks document for 2022, where we all have the ability to go back and look at this research and sort of, like Eric did with the remote viewing, access this stuff through the internet and really take an interest in it, but also to experience it. My day today has just been like a flood of different strange sort of ties into this this presentation and these thoughts. And I think that paying attention to that and kind of developing our own Tyler protocols and our own sort of James creative thoughts, it's really helpful. And I think that every researcher that's going to look into this stuff should have a practice of their own to some extent, whatever that is, whatever that becomes. I'm excited for the upcoming Archives of the Impossible thing, to be able to sort of see what other people are doing and to have this you know, a couple of days of just hammering this stuff out. And as kind of a postscript, um, well, this is the Windbridge motto: the normalize, optimize, utilize psi functioning. With Leonard, George had actually sort of butted up against one time. He said that, what if it isn't, you know, what if it isn't psi functioning? Like, what if there's nothing to optimize? What if it simply is sort of a beingness and an entity that we're interacting with? Which I think is a really interesting question. And I think in that, he was normalizing, optimizing, and utilizing psi functioning. But I think that, you know, my postscript here is that the importance of this stuff is that all along the way, it's existed within the real world. And the real world has wars, and the real world has violence and intelligence agencies and espionage and disinformation. And we're at a point now with the internet and with the digital culture where that stuff has started to exist in a way that it hadn't in the past, where we're constantly washed in this material. My friend Jose Herrera, who's a student of Diana's, past student of Diana's, he's mentioned in American Cosmic, and he's been working on some of this stuff in terms of, you know, military strategy and that. But the dangers of disinformation, the dangers of something like what Eric found with Pat Price, where he's been lauded as having clairvoyance and being able to access this non-local consciousness, but it may very well have been that he was just seeing disinfo in his future. And what does that mean? One of the questions that Jose is asking is, what does that mean if our futures are flooded with amped up messaging, with political rhetoric, with all of this stuff, and we become stuck in a feedback loop thanks to the internet and digital culture and the media of constantly seeing our future filled with trash that's automated by, you know, these sort of weaponized information spheres. And that's something to think about, and kind of puts an importance on understanding this stuff that maybe wasn't necessarily there before. You know, before the worry was that the Soviets were going to, you know, outpace us in their psychic espionage or whatever. But the issue now is that in 5th generation war forms, citizens are seen as soldiers too, and everything becomes weaponized. And once we have meta and all this other stuff that, you know, corporations and that are trying to develop, you know, our brains and our beings are being saturated in this information. And if we have this long self, if we exist in these precognitive states, you know, future states flooded with disinformation and degraded information stuff that are, you know, poisonous, that, you know, jack up our cortisol production, that ruin the frequencies that Tyler talks about, that break the machine, that could be very problematic. So I think that, you know, now's the time to normalize, optimize, and utilize psi functioning, and become the star children that we are, so that we can, you know, exist into the 21st century and hopefully make it a better place.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. So let's. Well, I certainly like to, if you're ready, Dave, open it up to some questions. I think,
yeah. Instead of questions, we can just have conversation, because everybody hears conversational.
That was awesome.
Absolutely.
David. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Did I misrepresent your ideas too much?
No, you're the most articulate exponent of the time loops worldview.
like I said before, I'm a Wargonian. You know, you got me. I was before I was a partial Wargonian. You know, I was fighting the Wargonian drift. Yeah, and then I was like, man, this
Finally
is
just gave in and it
kind of fits
let it
out.
flow
Yeah.
over you. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was an awesome talk. And I was so glad that you brought Harold Sherman into it, because he is, I've always thought of him as kind of the unsung, kind of weird thread of the sort of the psychic 20th century. I mean,
Yeah.
he really runs from, that amazing experiment he did. I'm blanking on the name of the explorer, in the 30s, but yeah, runs right up through the 60s with those books you talked about, which are awesome books, by the
Yeah.
way. And there's a great passage, like right at the beginning of, I think it's that book you showed, or one of his other ones, where he's talking about, his scenario is a mission to Venus, and the
Yeah. Right. That's yeah.
the communications, fails on the rocket. How are they going to get in touch with the
That's
astronaut?
exactly.
And they use
Yeah.
telepathy. That's the idea.
Yeah, that's exactly that's an interesting point too, is that in the book that you're talking about, and I think it's not the book that I showed, but it's another one that's just
Yeah, he
called
has two.
yeah, it's like how to use your ESP. But what was interesting is that in the Gerald Jackson book, the executive ESP, he says, in the next 5 or 10 years, everybody's going to be using psychism in corporate world. The world's going to be saturated in it. We need to learn it now. And in that Harold Sherman book, when he's talking about like using it for NASA, he's like, the next couple decades are going to be the psychic decade. We're all going to learn it. Like it's going to be, everyone will be using psychism in that. And that was where the question of who stole our psychic futures.
Well,
like,
and also, and he finishes that one anecdote about Venus. I think it's there that he talks about, it's going to bring world peace too.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
This was, huge. This is like the height of the Cold War. And what's so interesting to me, I mean, he sort of, I'm slowly working on something about this period in psychic history too. And he, what's interesting is he has this idea of telepathy promoting world peace and all that, and has this anecdote about communicating with a ship at distance. Well, it's so interesting that kind of the psychic Cold War, that took off with SRI. The prehistory of that was this idea that I think was, but actually it wasn't. Yeah, I think it may have been reported in Ostrander and Schroeder's book, that the Soviets had done this with submarines.
Right. Right.
Yes.
And then there was the story that we did it with a submarine, with the
Right.
Nautilus, which was completely fictional. It was this, and this goes is what's his name, Bergier, promoted that story. So I don't know. It's so interesting, this whole backstory of what became then the SRI research which was ostensibly set up to close the psi gap with
Right. Yeah. The great psi gap. Yeah.
Okay, but one of the things that's so interesting about Sherman is he was a real devotee of Urantia. He was a follower of the Urantia movement. And what I didn't hear you talk about here was, well, the big two, which are Theosophy and Scientology.
Right.
We all know about the Scientology connection to SRI and all that, but what Theosophy seemed to lurk
Yeah.
all
And
of this. And Urantia, Urantia was a smaller movement, but it has a lot of similarities both to Theosophy and to Scientology. I mean, it seems like almost a more kind of benign version of Scientology in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, what can you address those movements?
Yeah. And I mean, so the interesting thing with that is that, well, I mean, Scientology is weaponized Theosophy in a sense, because where, L. Ron Hubbard, you know, he's interacting with the sort of thelemic occult circles, the LA circles. I mean, honestly, it's just like the West Coast was just this hodgepodge of like whatever kind of like random popular occultism you wanted, and if you had money, you could get into the lodges, and if you were of a certain set, you could, you know, mix with different like things. And so L. Ron Hubbard, you know, he was in that milieu. He was in the sci-fi milieu, which was just like a wash in theosophy and that kind of stuff. And then he, you know, sort of weaponizes it and creates this religion that he builds up using these different, and New Thought. You know, I mean, it's such an American United States West Coast fomented kind of thing, you know. And the theosophical thought, every step that I take when I'm looking at this stuff, you know, the pre-SRI stuff and that, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Especially if you look at the stuff that Puharich was because, you know, Puharich gets written out of the whole history of everything. Like he's like the black sheep of parapsychology. They don't want to talk about him. And I started to realize why when I was reading some of his late 70s and early 80s interviews, because he's just goes on these like long rants about theosophy. And so, you know, he had so the Star Children album with Ingo, with Stephen Halpern and Ingo, parallels research that Puharich was doing with what he called the Star Children, or the Space Children. I'm sorry. So Star Children is the album. Space Children is what Puharich was looking at. And the Space Children came out of the Geller kids, which were these kids that it was reported and I guess tested, because all that stuff try to find the actual details of this stuff. Like, who knows? I guess Puharich's kids are doing a documentary, and hopefully maybe some of that stuff still exists. No one has bothered to like ask them for it, though. A lot of conspiracy folks have, you know, worried about the space kids and all the rest of the stuff, but nobody's actually looked for this material. They also haven't cited the interviews that he did, which you can find if you know, look through this stuff. So I just ran across those and was very excited to see him talking about the space kid thing. But it turns out that you had Geller was having his spectra, right? Like he was getting his abilities from this UFO that was hovering over, you know, very Philip K. Dickian sort of sense that he said that he was doing. Puharich and him were basically running on this weird psychic questing thing that they were doing, where they were seeing Horus and these messages and omens and that kind of thing, to the point where even Geller was like, Puharich, chill out a little bit, buddy. Like, you're getting kind of weird on this, you know? But Puharich, when Geller was being televised, this phenomena started happening where kids were watching, you know, allegedly, because again, we don't have any examples of this research. So the story is that these kids would watch, they would then be bending spoons, and that just by seeing Geller do it, which makes sense for kind of the description of how spoon bending is done, which is the spoon doesn't exist. You know, these different mantras that people have to do the spoon bending. I could see how a kid, not really, you know, with no pre-formatted sense of what reality is, seeing this happen on TV and being like, oh, I bent a spoon, right? So Puharich then was getting contacted, because he was kind of Geller's handler. He was getting contacted by parents, you know, or seeing parents talk about it. There were news stories about it. And he essentially started collecting these kids for experiments, and, you know, finding the best ones of them. And, you know, this again is sort of this weird period, this kind of almost I want to say dark ages, in the sense that like what's written up about it is in scraps and bits, but the funding was much different back then during that time period. And there were people like, is it Henry Belk, I think is his name? Henry Belk, who was basically just pointing to researchers and being like, here's money, go over to the Philippines and look at a psychic doctor. You know, here's money, go to South America and go look at what they're doing down there in, you know, their trance rituals and stuff like that, and then come back with a report. And he was, you know, so Puharich was kind of getting funded like that. And so he's got these kids that they're, you know, they're expressing their abilities or whatever. He called them space kids. And this gets back to the theosophy thing after a long circumnavigative route there. But he felt that they were the sixth root race or the fifth root race. So the theosophical idea of these different races that came up out of Atlantis and Lemuria, and that basically these space kids, these Geller kids, were the next stage of evolution. And he talks very explicitly about that in his interviews in the late 70s and 80s about, you know, this is it, like these kids are it. Like, so we have that now with the Indigo kids, but it's been soft sold through this like weird, whatever happened in the late 80s and 90s sort of like vision, like kaleidoscope twisted vision of it. Whereas Puharich was like, no, theosophy said, you know, Madame Blavatsky said that this was going to happen and this is what's happening. And we have this new root race. And these kids will be the next, you know, step in evolution. So, you know, and that's again with John White, who I mentioned with the Homo Noeticus. He co-edits an anthology with Brad Steiger. Brad Steiger, who had also popularized the starseed stuff in the 70s and 80s. Other Worlds, Other Universes, I think it is. It includes Rudolf Steiner. It includes, I believe it includes the woman that channeled, that led Halpern to experience this channeling phenomena that helped him with his music. It includes Valet. It includes Timothy Leary and his starseed transmissions. And this thing was published in '74, which is about when the SRI research kicks in. And it was still at a time when Edgar Mitchell wasn't talking about UFOs. And John White was involved with the Institute of Noetic Science. So this theosophical space age theosophy with, you know, contact of these other beings is very much underlying this whole era and this whole sort of alternate network to what we know. And that's kind of what I traced out here is, you know, the Eileen Garrett strand of parapsychology touches on the SRI stuff, but it's like everything that SRI wants to forget ever happened. And it's everything that is sort of, you know, it's like the embarrassing punk rock brother of, you know, punk rock sibling of the legitimatized parapsychology that we have today. But I also think it's the more potent branch, you know, that is actually like a little bit more functional and may actually have more to do with the long self and precognition concepts in that. Because these people, I think, were a little bit more honest. So it's weird because they were more creative in their theorizing, and they're really like just like throwing out ideas, but at the same time they're less like tied to what they're saying, and if that makes sense. Like they're not as hardline, like they're not, if they have different experimental results or if something looks like it's different, they'll go with it. Whereas I think what we have in the sort of legitimatized parapsychology is a lot more people who are like, this is my idea, and this was my idea, and this is my idea, and then they shoehorn things to fit into their idea, you know. So a lot more sort of experimental and applied. And I find that too in the Borderland Science Research, which is a really weird publication because it starts prior to the UFO era, right? Prior to the age of flying saucers. I think it starts in 45 or 46. It publishes some of the first pre-Kenneth Arnold flying saucer stuff. And then it carries through the contactee period. Riley Crabb, who takes over from Mead Lane, both of them were esoteric theosophists. So nobody at the Theosophical Society would own these people or want anything to do with them, but they were drawing on Bailey and Blavatsky and anthroposophy through Steiner and that kind of stuff, very heavily. Riley Crabb actually creates his own sort of space age theosophy with sort of Gurdjieffian like tangents to it, with this idea of the lunar mafia, which are the men in black. They like run the men in black. Then there's the he's got the lunar mafia, the solar mafia, the zodiacal mafia, and then the galactic mafia. So at each stage, you know, you're controlled by these different forces, and the true adept is the one who, like, you know, you're fighting all the mafias, right? Like, you don't want any of them controlling you. You don't want the solar influence, you don't want the lunar influence, you don't want the zodiac influence, you don't want the galactic influence. And that's actually a very like esoteric idea that comes out of, you know, you can find that in esoteric practice across religions, this idea of breaking through the influences of the hierarchy. Giordano Bruno talks about it in his Cause, Principle, and Unity. But so yeah, so this theosophical thing is like sitting there really obviously, but and then again in people like Puharich, where he had no filter. So in an interview, he's going to be like, yeah, well, these kids are the root race, you know, whereas other people like Puthoff will be like, oh yeah, I was doing some stuff with Scientology at one point. Like, you got cleared. Like, you can't just say, you can't like go clear and then say like, I'm just investigating it a little bit, it was kind of interesting. Like, how do you spend that much time with a biofeedback device? And just, you know, even William S. Burroughs was a little bit more, you know, like honest about his time with Scientology and that, you know, whereas, yeah, and I say that because Hal Puthoff was just in that conversation with Weinstein, where he was asked about the Scientology thing, and he talks about it like it was a trip to the like gas station. Like, well, I was there for a minute and like I bought some chips. Like, that's not true. You know, like, you may not be in it, you may not be the, you know, Scientology guy now, but you certainly spent time with it, you know. And Ingo Swann, I think, was a little bit more honest in his writing about it too. He wasn't really a joiner, you know, so I think he used the tech and like he got interested in that. But yeah, there's this definite like sort of weird, you know, tendency, or, you know, Russell Targ saying that UFOs weren't a thing, that they were only a thing for the Scientologists that were involved. But then you look at John White and you look at Edgar Mitchell and you look at like this underlying thread of star children and star beings and the evolutionary sense of psi and all the rest of it, and it's like, that can't be true. Like, you don't get multiple anthologies, you don't get Brad Steiger talking to all these different research. I mean, Brad Steiger is interesting in the fact that, again, here's another person that like no parapsychologist is going to look at Brad Steiger and be like, that guy, yeah, I want to stand by that guy who wrote, you know, like My Pet's super abilities and stuff like that. They're not going to do that. But if you look at Brad's publishing history, he published, again, with John White, you know, he was talking to Gene Houston and Robert Masters during their Sekhmet channeling. He himself had a Sekhmet encounter during that time period. You know, Gene Houston and Robert Masters are two of the people that were doing the hypnosis sessions after the space missions, you know, with the Apollo astronauts to do hypnotic regression to see if they could remember anything, you know. So there's all these different tie-ins, which you'd think that the people who were there would know, but they don't, you know, they don't talk about that. So it's very weird, Theosophy and Scientology being sort of within that milieu of just like, it was definitely there. We have evidence that like it played a heavy hand in stuff, you know. And I think the other thing to look at too with something like Theosophy or Scientology is that there's two elements to it. You know, there's more than two, but there's two elements that like would be effective. There's the cosmology that these things present, and then there's the practices, you know. So Theosophy has a ton of practices, which, you know, Russell Targ talks about him being a young theosophist and how the, you know, the psychic training that you get in Theosophy was helpful to him? Did he, you know, and obviously like his ties to, you know, the Yoga Sutras and that like came out of sort of a theosophical milieu, because he's not a, you know, he may have talked to some Buddhists and stuff, but he's not like an actual like Buddhist, you know, like he's not from the straight, like he's not from directly from the vine, you know, like he's got some other influences there. So
I wonder the extent to which we think of these involvements in Scientology and theosophy as kind of interesting and strange, may partly be a function of the fact that we live in such a kind of spiritual smorgasbord, you know, with the internet nowadays, and that, you know, back in the day there weren't that many options. If you were interested in human potential outside of the scope of one of the, you know, mainstream religions, there weren't that many options.
right.
And you know, you know, you're a young young searching you know, person, and there's a guy on the street who hands you Dianetics, you know, and seems to answer your questions and be pretty interesting. It's not like you have like all this array of ideas that are available to you. You know.
Well, and it's effective too. I mean, that's the
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
The tech in Scientology is effective. Like, I want one of those e-meters.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like I would love to have
Well,
an e-meter or whatever.
I tried to make one.
Yeah,
You theoretically can using an ammeter,
yeah,
and you have
yeah.
to like get, you know, you have to do a bunch of crap that goes beyond my skill level. But yeah,
Yeah, that's
Is it a complicated machine? Hi, folks.
it's not.
Hey,
amazing.
David,
It's
Eric,
not.
it's good to see
It's a very simple machine. It's simply an ammeter, but it's, I guess the sensitivity is slightly different from what you'd find in most typical ammeters, and you know, it's with
Okay.
2 tin cans. That's really all it is.
It's strange that Hal Puthoff found that to be an interesting machine design, and it was one of the things that he claimed interested him about Scientology and the Scientologists.
Yeah, he wrote an article about it.
Well, and
Yeah.
he was working with gosh, what's his name? This is another like The Secret Life of Plants guy.
Oh yeah, Cleve Baxter.
Yeah, Cleve Baxter. So he was doing that's, I'm glad you said that, Hussein, because I didn't know that that was what particularly interested him, because I mean, Cleve Baxter was basically doing like sticking an ammeter in a plant, you know. I mean,
Right. Well, you know, it's an interesting sort of thing because you know, what Cleve Baxter was claiming was that not just that plants were sentient, but that you could detect that sentience through some kind of like bioelectric field.
right. Right.
And you know, that the idea of this bioelectric field has been a really kind of prominent one within you know, studies that are either directly or tangentially connected to psychic sensation and psychic functioning. So even folks like Marcel Vogel, who we did a little bit of work on, you know, like his only real book, if I remember right, was a book on plant communication and plant sentience.
Right.
Right. And so, you know, he did all that work on crystal technology and so on, even though he worked for IBM and it's the reason why we have credit cards today, the magnetic stripe technology and so on. It's like, it's amazing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that was you know, he was the like an early meta experiencer, or one of the meta experiencers.
Exactly.
And I think it's interesting too, like the Cleve Baxter with the this biological transmission, because that's L. George Lawrence.
That's right.
Is another figure that no one talked, like L. George Lawrence has been completely erased, but
Absolutely.
he was a electronic warfare guy. He was doing radar systems and that for the military, and he was working with Cleve Baxter as well. And he started working on he set up basically it was a telescope, but it wasn't a telescope. It was for focusing, basically like a SETI kind of setup, right? But like,
yeah, except it was like a plantoscope.
Yeah, yeah, a plantoscope, exactly. And so it had these, it's like receptor, right? The receptor on the other end of this is not like, it's not like an eyepiece. It's a sensor system that's organic. It's an organic sensor system. And so he was using what Cleve Baxter was discovering about plant reactions, which actually, and again, this is another thing that like, um, if you look in straight science, you can find examples of now where they're using plants as sensors for various things, right? Because at a basic level, the plant will tell you if there's radiation, or the plant will tell you if, you know, the temperature is changing, or if there's a vibration. So there's different things you can measure from the plant. But what they were doing, they were taking it like way farther. And so George Lawrence was taking that organic receptivity, which also, if we think of Skinwalker Ranch and this idea of using the human body as a sensor system, and using the human body as a petri dish, or the human body as when the, you know, when the phenomena hits the body, it causes a stress reaction, right? Then that stress reaction can be measured. Then
Right.
this is the same kind of thing that L. George Lawrence, but L. George Lawrence wasn't taking a body; he was taking a slide of organic material that he had developed to then take these transmissions from space. He was publishing with the Borderlands Science Research people as well. But yeah, he's got this big book, like it's this big bound book on this experiments, which he was also doing out at Giant Rock. So post contactee era Giant Rock, he was out at Giant Rock doing these experiments with these biological transmissions from space. And he has write-ups, I don't remember the magazines, but they were legitimate science publications, where he was writing up his experiments and where he was writing up articles, popular kind of facing science articles on this stuff.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, is that if you can trace that out even further. And there's like a person today, I think he's in Tufts University. His name is Michael Levine, and he's done this amazing work on the bioelectric field of organisms, and he's been able to hack them in these really interesting ways, and get them to regenerate and do all kinds of stuff. But he talks a lot about the relationship between the bioelectric field and sensation. And that because he's also like really into computation, one of the things that he begins to theorize is that the human body with its or even living organisms with their bioelectric fields, they're basically sort of universal constructors almost, which is to say that you can, with living material, you can produce almost any phenomenon that you want, so yeah, you want to create anti-gravity, you can do it. It's just a matter of understanding how the bioelectric field works, right? And then I remember, Eric, and this is just to go back to why maybe Hal was interested in this. There was a time when you and I actually had a chance to talk with him really briefly. You remember that? And one of the questions we asked him is the connection between Psi and UFOs. And what he talked about was a patent that he was working on that was working with electromagnetic fields, but it was an aspect of the electromagnetic fields that was called the Aronoff bomb effect or something like that, which is like, effects that go beyond the actual electromagnetic field. It's like, you can affect things that are actually outside of the electromagnetic field. And that for him was the basis of, communication of a psychic kind across space and time, and so on. So there's this really interesting line between, say, his interest in this particular e-meter in Scientology,
right,
Cleve Baxter, all the way to like now, right?
And also, just
yeah,
to
so it's
highlight that, that's the unwritten history of this stuff again.
right.
Because that's that's Ingo Swann, who's also been sort of sidelined, and people aren't, he's the you know, the proto remote viewer, like the remote viewer who like existed before time, you know, but people don't read his stuff. Like they're not reading the like, what is it, bio, I mean, he writes about bioenergy in his
The human bio-mind.
the human biominde. Yeah, the
Right.
super, he's got super in there somewhere too, like the superhuman biominde or something. But you know, and he was looking at, that's what the Russians were looking at too.
Right.
And he was really interested not just in this Psi gap idea of let's beat the Russians and figure this out, but he in his in Natural ESP, which we got here, in Natural ESP, which he did in like the late 80s, this book, like heavily critiques American parapsychology and British and European parapsychology. Like he just tears into it. And then he goes right to the Russian stuff, and he's like, they ditched all this materialist garbage like a long time ago, which is the same thing that Ed May says about when he went and talked to the you know, after the Soviet, the post-Soviet remote viewers, and that was that he was shocked because Ed May's like a hardline materialist atheist, and he went to these, you know, post-Soviet Psi researchers, and they were all these weird like cosmist mystics, you know. And Ingo really takes up with that and like takes that, and that's, you know, obviously from Star Children and his paintings and his later writings, that's where he was going with it, was this sort of cosmist evolutionary drift, which, you know, and Hussein tying into what you're saying with this sort of like bioenergy, right? Like not electromagnetism necessarily, you know, and that's where the radionics and that kind of stuff come in too, because they're, whatever the legitimacy of what any individual radionics practitioner does, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for what is that force that is the Aramov-Bohm effect. Like what is that extra, like untappable sort of thing, you know?
Yeah, there's an interesting story there. But speaking of Ingo Swann, I did want to ask you a question, David, actually, if it's all right. And it's, you know, so, you know, you've given this, I really enjoyed your talk, and just, you know, this story of sort of the development of different Psi practices, techniques, you know, particularly in, you know, in a modern setting and so on. But, you know, I had done a little bit of research at the University of West Georgia, as you know, in the Ingo Swann archives. And, you know, one of the things that over time he becomes increasingly concerned with, and you know, he writes this, you know, many times, is he says that, you know, human beings seem to be subject to a kind of continual collective forgetting of their innate psychic capacities, abilities over time. You know, so it's like, you know, it's kind of there, it percolates, and then, you know, maybe people realize it for a while, and then it kind of just disappears, and it's almost like it's not a story of progress. It's a story of like remembering for a few moments and then forgetting most of the time. And he began to wonder about what the sources of that kind of collective forgetting were.
Right.
And so I was wondering, you know, how you fit that. I mean, I don't know if you agree with Ingo that, you know, that this kind of collective forgetting is happening in such a continual way. But like, you know, how do you fit the story of what you're kind of talking about, which is kind of like the development and the transformation of Psi, you know, with the kind of collective forgetting that Ingo was talking about?
Yeah, well, and this is interesting. That's a great question. I think it's more than a question, though. I think that's like a space, because that, I think that ties into what Eric is talking about with the theosophy as well, and the Scientology, because I think both of those in a certain way are trying to, their cosmology is attempting to address that question. You know, with this idea of, in Scientology, the, you know, this evil alien force that like we're reincarnating, and this sort of battle that happens. And then in Theosophy with this idea of the root races, but then with Steiner, who became a big focus for the Borderlands people, for Trevor James Constable, who was I don't even know what to call him. He was like a Steiner loving, radionics using ufologist, but more so than that, like Reichian. He was what only America can produce, I guess. I don't know how to really take Constable in that, but he his views of Steiner were, you know, and Reich, right? Reich had the same kind of thing, was this sense of the deadly orgone versus the orgone, and this idea that like there was this deadly orgone force, which would come in and kind of you know, at times cause desertification, you know. And while Reich in his book How to Contact Space or something like that, I forget what exactly it's called, but one of his later works, Reich talks about feeling that he is a star child, that he is this extraterrestrial that has been born on Earth to sort of bring this message or whatever. But at the same time as saying that, and saying that like he identifies with the sort of UFO consciousness, that there's also the UFOs that are deadly orgone radiation that are going to like cause desertification and destroy things. You know, in Steiner's work, you have Lucifer and Ahriman. Ahriman comes from within. It's the materialist force. It's our body. You know, it controls the body. And then Lucifer is the force of the air, which comes through the mind and the spirit. And either one of those too much will, you know, cause sort of a de-evolution of the human, and the destruction of the human. That's kind of where Riley Crabb was going with the lunar mafia, right? Like stopping psychic development. The men in black always come in, and, you know, if you're looking too far into something, the men in black show up and they stop it. Keel has some stuff along those lines as well. You know, it seems like anyone who sort of goes into these areas and starts to explore faces that kind of sense that there's something else there. Now, Ingo, though, I think one of the things that in some of the stuff you got from the archives, which is really interesting, is that Ingo goes through historically and shows these different periods of like, you know, where you had the oracles at Delphi, and then the oracles die, right? Like, and they get kind of shut out. And then you have the, you know, the rise of alchemy and the great sort of European tradition, and then that gets killed. And then you have the sort of occult revival stuff, and then that gets killed. And that's also, I think, you know, now that you've said that, it's almost like you can see that in some of the stuff I was trying to point out, where like the Society for Psychical Research comes out of this sort of sphere, and then you have this transition through Rhine, which is its own sort of world, and Harold Sherman is this bridge then, you know, into this other world. And at each of these different stages we forget, right? Like all these people that we've been talking about that are, you know, sort of forgotten figures. So I do, you know, I would agree with him that there is this weird forgetting. And interestingly enough too, Eileen Garrett was initiated into her psychism. So she had experiences since she was a child, but they were fully, her mediumship was fully activated by a New Thought kind of spiritist medium who hypnotized her and used hypnosis to induce her mediumistic states and get her control that she used. And he wrote a book which talks in a similar vein to what Ingo talks about the witch hunt period being a purge of psychic individuals. And he's got this whole section of a chapter talking about how essentially what you see in Europe during, you know, the period of the witch hunts is a sort of purge of psychics. I don't know how well that plays out historically. You know, any of these kind of like, see, it's weird to see things from like the psychic perspective, the psychic world perspective, but then to also know like the straight history perspective, where like the witchcraft trials come at periods of tension where like there's a lot of stuff going on, and it wasn't just people hunting down psychics and killing them. There's a lot of socio-political issues with different, you've got the more Spain collapsing, and you've got like the pogroms and the Jew. I mean, you got a lot of stuff going on. So it's not just like killing psychics, but
the Russians that Jacques Vallée met with told him the same thing.
That which
yeah,
one?
you Europeans.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah, you killed your psychics. Yeah. And I mean, it's an interesting kind of thought, especially in time periods of, you think of Nazi Germany, where, whether or not the focus was to kill psychics, the number of people that were killed, you're killing off a huge section of your gene pool, and you're killing off like really targeted areas where that may be, where the psychics are, and you look at our culture now, and I don't know, there's a weird, it doesn't really foster psychics, you know what I mean, like beyond the difficulty of like the trauma and that kind of thing, the trauma trigger and the difficult sort of behavioral disorder elements of psychism that can be attendant with that. Just the freedom to explore those things, I mean, I'm thankful to live in like rural Georgia, where I can go out and see the stars and have a quiet night. You think about like, just the what it takes to actually like sort of experience this stuff, and how our culture like sort of goes against it. I'm really interested in that though, Hussein, in terms of looking at it, because I think like when I read Ingo's stuff, or when I hear this, like the Russians that told Vallée that and all that, again, it's just like the hard historicism, like the Wouter Hanegraaff, like is like, no, but that's not, if you go and you look at the actual history of what's going on there's all these other forces, there's all these other things going on. And I think it would be really interesting though to take both, to take both and sort of look at it and see what's going on and what happened there,
David, I want to thank you for a terrific presentation. I've taken notes. There's a lot to think about. I'm going to have to bow out at this point, and I just wanted to thank you and to say good night and best wishes to you other gentlemen. And I'd love to do this weekly.
Yeah, right. This is like this is almost like a fringe New Jersey salon. We can put you as like a co. But
you see, the witching hour approaches in beautiful Delaware here on the right coast, and we got to go. So good night, all, and best wishes.
Michael. Take care.
Nice to see you.
Good night. I'm gonna have to bow out soon too. This is way past my bedtime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost 2:00 here in Buenos Aires. So
yeah, you're done. You're in like the full different time zone.
Yeah. Way down south.
And you already had. Did you record that tonight? Was your webinar tonight that you recorded, or you said you did one that was?
Well, what we did was, because sometimes my internet was shoddy. We did it like a webinar yesterday, and we recorded that. And I don't know. I like the webinar that we did yesterday because we just had to repeat everything that we said, today, which was kind of awkward, and slightly forced, So I don't know what they're gonna put up for posterity.
Right. Hussein, I did have something I wanted to tell you.
Oh yeah.
Which I would sort of fit into this. There was a question that was asked of the causal effect of UFOs on religion.
Oh right, yeah.
And it was interesting because causal effect in religion is really only looked at, and so I was listening to the webinar when I was driving. So like I was like driving, and I'm like, ooh, like I wanna, like but Barry Downing, I think is his name, wrote a book called Flying Saucers in the Bible. And it's it fits within, Eric, it fits within the Ace paperback only. I believe it's a It's one of those, like it's a total pulp paperback. But when I started reading it, I was shocked because he starts talking about Paul Tillich. He's actually like talking about legitimate theology. Like I think he addresses Bonhoeffer. I mean, it's like when you
Wow.
look at it, yeah, his list of like people that he's sort of in conversation with, it was like, wow, he's actually doing legitimate theology here. Like this is not just, I'm talking about UFOs in the Bible and I'm a pastor and I've got some ideas. Like he was really trying to fit UFOs into I think it was written in like 66 or 67. And he was really trying to fit the UFO thing into the theological conversation at the time. It's really interesting. But what he does with that, because it's theology and it's not religious studies, he goes to the causal level and he talks about UFOs as a causal agent in Christianity, like very directly. Like he goes in and he does an exegesis with UFOs. And I didn't even think it was possible to see like a legitimate it's a legitimate exegesis and it's got UFOs. And I was like, this is too much. Like, because when I read it, I was like, I got it thinking like it'll be interesting and it'll have, maybe some interesting stuff in it. But when I started reading it, and it was, it was like a straight academic exegesis with UFOs. And I was like,
Well,
this is too much. So to something to look at, and I will probably like email Jeff with this too, but Barry Downing's work, he's still alive. He's kind of
oh,
crazy.
really?
Yeah, he's a little bit he's not a happy person necessarily, and he's very defensive of his ideas. So I don't know what kind of dialogue could be had, but his book, and he's got like an update, he's got like maybe 3 books. But his book definitely is an example of fitting the UFO into a religious context as a causal agent.
Right. That's cool. It's just that, when that question was asked of me, I mean, there has been a lot written about that, but the sense that I got was that I was being asked about, straight up conventional academic books, which look at that.
Yeah.
I was like, well, no. I mean, Diana talks about it a little bit, and Jeff talks about it, but nothing really, but I mean, if you want to go outside of the academic sphere, which is totally fine, there's a lot of stuff, and some of it is good, and a lot of it isn't so good. But I mean, so I didn't know what to do with that question. That's just, that's why I don't do these like webinars and stuff. I'm like, it takes me an hour to think like of an answer to a question. And then I'm like, oh, I should have said that, and then I spend the next week regretting what I said.
Awesome.
Yeah. So.
Well, I was inspired. I got inspired by listening to it. So I'm looking forward to the recording so I can go back and.
Yeah. I don't know which recording Jeff will put up, and like I said, I liked the yesterday because it just felt more natural.
Yeah, it was hard to redo it. Like that's a tough, tough request.
Yeah. And he was like, "Yeah, we're gonna have the same conversation." I'm like, I don't remember what I said. So, but anyway, Eric, it's good to see you too.
Yeah, good to see you, or not to see you, but hear you. And that was a great conversation today. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to have this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, folks, I'm going to sign off because it's 2:00 in the morning here.
Yeah.
But I'm going to have to too.
Sweet. Thank you guys for sticking around.
But no, it's I mean, like, I wish we could do this every day.
Yeah, this is
and and we should maybe
we can have East West Books back channel and just broadcast the strange, the paranormal, the esoteric once a week.
Once a week, wouldn't it be cool? All right, folks, have a really good night. Really good to see you all, to hear you all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care, huh?
Yeah.
Bye.